Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's lecture by Matt Cole. Matt's going to talk to us about the Liberal politician Richard Wainwright, who was MP for Spen Valley. Matt's written a book about Richard that was published in 2011 and is very, very highly regarded. Matt's background is he describes himself as a historian of modern Britain with particular interests in 20th century constitutional and party politics and the regional history of the Northwest. Since 2003, he has worked with the Regional History Centre at the University of Lancaster. He researches, writes and broadcasts on social and political change and its historical background. So over to you, Matt.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming on this evening. Particular thank you to the officers of the Thorpe Society for arranging this. I'm aware I may face a little skepticism from you, speaking about a politician that most people don't know that much about, who I've associated with Leeds, but who never represented Leeds, either on the council or in Parliament, and who never got into the cabinet. And you may therefore think, why am I interested in this person, and why have I spent quite a lot of time looking into his life? I think you will find, and I hope you will agree at the end of this, that his life is a very significant one. It tells us about politics in the 20th century, the whole of the 20th century. It tells us in particular about his party, the Liberal Party, and its successors and allies, but also about other parties too. And it tells us something about how politicians might and perhaps should conduct themselves. It also does tell us something about Leeds, I think, because he has an association with it. So let me say first of all that my work on this was begun some years ago, yes, and with the support and cooperation of the Wainwright family, to whom I want to give my thanks for their support, and also all the other politicians and associates of Wainwright who helped write the book. And I want therefore to take the course of Wainwright's history, in which this is three examples of his life. Here he is getting married to his wife Joyce at Leeds Parish Church. He is campaigning in his constituency, the Colne Valley, not too far from here. And here he is working in the House of Commons. And I would argue, apart from anything else, being a Liberal member of Parliament for 17 years, at the time of the party's almost lowest fortunes, makes you an interesting person anyway. Having joined 30 years earlier, when it was at its lowest fortunes, and stayed with it, makes you an interesting person as well. What is it about a person that makes them loyal to their party, and yet to be quite a critic of its leadership as well? Well, these are the themes I'm going to strike on. Wainwright's origins, very much based in Leeds. What he did as a member of Parliament, and in influencing government and influencing his party's leadership, and what lessons we might draw from that about politics at the time and even today, and even, I'm going to suggest, slightly into the future. Here are the simple milestones of his life. He was born in 1918 in Leeds, in Roundhay. He went away for most of his education to boarding school and then to Cambridge. And that process, I think, is an interesting one as a sort of apprenticeship for parliamentary office, or for a public life of some sort, which was a route that perhaps doesn't exist anymore. I'm not sure. We can have a think about that. During the war, he was a conscientious objector. He was Methodist and a strict conscientious objector, and served in the Friends Ambulance Unit, a matter which reflected his faith from before the war and which affected his political career afterwards, or might have done. And that's, again, something I'll say a little bit about. He did contest a Leeds seat, Pudsey. Do we count Pudsey as a Leeds seat? Nervous silence there. But he became the Member of Parliament for Colne Valley, which is the South Pennine area in West Yorkshire, just to the west of Huddersfield, but almost tipping into Manchester at the other end, very large seat. And he held that seat for 17 years, spread across 21 years. He lost it once and got it back, which no other Liberal MP at the time did. No Liberal MP between the wars, having won a seat and lost it, got it back. And that again is
he just started
his persistence, of his tenaciousness. And he, although he went into retirement in 1987, he remained involved in politics. And I'll say a little bit about how he felt the formation of the Liberal Democrats reflected what he'd hoped for and what he might think about what's happened since. Just a few of his associations with Leeds. These aren't exactly geographically correct, but roughly speaking, key feature of his life was his faith. He initially attended the Lady Lane Chapel, which is no longer a religious building. It was replaced by the Gipton Chapel in the 1930s. His parents were officials of it. He trained as a lay preacher, Methodist lay preacher. It was quite important in his appeal to certain parts of the electorate, but it was even more important in establishing certain principles for him and in giving him a sense of public duty to engage with policy issues, to do things, to make changes, to make the world better in this life, not just to think of the next. He was born at Roundhay, or lived first at Roundhay, and moved to Adel, to this house here, which I'll show you later. He lived in Leeds throughout his life, despite representing a constituency slightly distant from it. He was a loyal resident, and I don't think would have considered living in Wales. It clearly would have been in his interest to move to his constituency, but he didn't do it. Didn't think it necessary to prove his Yorkshire credentials, which he was very proud of, and he didn't want to be outside the city. He remained involved with the city in a number of ways. He was involved with a number of city businesses. His father was a partner at Beavers and Adgie, an accounting firm in Park Row. That's the building which is still there. That's where his offices were. And Wainwright himself became a partner in this accountancy firm just after the war. His family and he himself owned shares in Thackeray Medical Supplies and Great George Street, which had premises all around the city, employed hundreds of people by the 1970s. And he was involved in, had investments in a number of other businesses. The Leeds Metropole Hotel, he had shares in from a very young age, which his father had first invested in. Yorkshire Television, he had some investments in. He took a very clear view about whether politicians should be involved in business. And he said there's nothing wrong with politicians having business interests. He said you have to be transparent about them, but he felt that politicians who were reliant on their parliamentary salary and who would be faced with unemployment and no income, if they didn't remain in Parliament, were less likely to be good members of Parliament. They would feel more dependent on their political leadership, and that's something we've as a principle we've had tested, if not to destruction, then quite hard in recent times. He also, as I say, fought a seat in, or at least near Leeds, in Pudsey. Very important for reasons I'll go into, because it was a very unpromising seat at a very unpromising time for the Liberals. And yet he worked very, very hard on it and actually managed to save their fortunes in that seat, demonstrating his faith in the long game, in working at things over a long period. Now, why did Wainwright not contest a seat that he won in Leeds? Very simply, these images give you a strong impression of why. He was an electoral realist. He believed in playing the long game, but if at the end of a long game you weren't going to get what you wanted, he was realistic enough not to try working at it when you needed quick results. These are some of the key figures of Leeds politics in the post-war period. I haven't put the names up immediately just to give you a chance to shout them out. And it doesn't mean to say you like them, by the way. The cabinet ministers of the post-war period with Leeds constituencies. We've got Hugh Gateskill, Leader of the Opposition and Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Dennis Healey, also Defence Secretary. Merlin Rees, we're getting into the slightly less obvious ones. Home Secretary and Northern Ireland, and Chief Joseph, the great ally of Margaret Thatcher's, represented a Leeds constituency. Leeds was definitely on the national political map in the 1960s and 70s and the whole of the post-war period. But the fortunes of the Liberals were not strong. One thing we learn about looking at Wainwright's career and the fact that he didn't try to base his political career in Leeds, perfectly sensibly, was that the Liberals, who had dominated Leeds up until the beginning of the 20th century and had still been major players up until the First World War, had by Wainwright's life, by the interwar period, been reduced to a handful of seats on the council. I mean, the whole council was re-elected in a big sweep in the mid-30s, and I think they ended up with 4 seats, and all of those had no Conservative opponent. The Liberals have very dramatically, following the First World War, lost their place in Leeds politics. Most of the time, they didn't contest most of the seats in Leeds until the 1960s, and very much with Wainwright's encouragement, Michael Meadowcroft, who many of you will know, became involved in the council from the late 60s onwards, and was very much mentored by Wainwright. And Greg Mulholland was also the only other Leeds Liberal or Liberal Democrat MP since the Second World War, who actually was one of the last people Wainwright mentored. He went to see Richard Wainwright shortly before his death to get his advice on how to fight his seat in Leeds, and named his headquarters in the constituency afterwards. It's called Wainwright House. So Wainwright was a realist about politics in Leeds, but when the opportunity came, he was generous in using his experience and support to help those that did get Liberalism going again in Leeds. This is, just to give you the answers, this is the Liberal vote in Leeds elections, council elections from 1973 to 2010, and sorry, 2012. And what it shows you is that even at the peak of the Liberals' success, they didn't get to the kind of place they did in, for example, Liverpool, where they ran the council. It was hard work for those people reviving liberalism, and Wainwright knew if he was going to get elected, he would need to find a seat that would make it possible for him to do it relatively soon. It certainly wasn't immediate, but if we want to know why he didn't represent the city in which he lived, virtually no Liberal did until the 1960s. Here's his childhood. Here's where he grew up. This is the drive in Roundhay, where he was born and lived until the 1930s, till he was at university, essentially. His family, and this is a sign of the nature of his background, suddenly moved to this house here. The heath at Adel, it's on Long Causeway. I think the ground has just been developed now, and new housing has been put on it. So all this open space here wasn't there. He was a great gardener. His parents were very proud of the grounds of their house. And you can see the scale of it here, because it's Victorian northern townhouse, or what a mansion, if you like. They even featured on the front of a gardening textbook, which slightly disingenuously was called the Beginner's Garden. Since they had professional gardeners, it was not really quite right at the beginning of it, gardening experience. They won lots of awards for their delphiniums and held garden events to support the Liberal Party and lots of charities in Leeds. So it was a very prosperous existence. One of the features of Wainwright's life was that he was from this class of northern professional and business figures who were sort of semi-political. His father had got the OBE for interviewing virtually every unemployed man. He was on the Unemployed Assistance Board in Leeds, interviewed almost every unemployed man in Leeds under 30, trying to find him a job. So he was involved in politics, but not party politics. He was involved in civic work. He subscribed to lots of organisations and projects that were for the public good, and he wanted his son to go into politics. His wife Joyce said, when Richard was elected, it was it was what his father had always wanted. His father just got to see him become a member of Parliament. So this idea of a civic class in a northern industrial city, which was very prosperous, very civic-minded, and was bound into the municipal and social life of the city and political life of the city, is something Wainwright grew up with. I'm not sure you could say anybody could grow up with that anymore because of changes in industry, changes in society, changes in culture. It's a background that Wainwright might have been in the last group of people to enjoy. This is part of what it made possible. His education started in Ingledew Crescent, I think. Yes, it is Crescent, in Roundhay, not far from his house. A place called Ingledew College. It's in 2 suburban houses. But you can see from the reference here that the qualifications and the examinations of the institute of the leadership and the examinations run by the institution indicated that it was a preparation to go somewhere else. He then went. This is Richard in the middle here, front and centre, at a place called Street Court School in Kent. It's been set up by the father of A.A. Milne, the writer of Winnie the Pooh. And he had to go down to Kent. His mother was not at all pleased about this, to go and board there, and you can see from the nature of the dress what kind of an institution it was. He was there from the late 20s to the early 30s. That was a preparation for going to Shrewsbury School. Again, not particularly nearby, boarding school experience, but one which, again, I mean, we were discussing earlier, weren't we? There were a number of young men from professional and business families that went to Shrewsbury. When I went to Shrewsbury to look at Wainwright's records, you could see, even in their recruitment today, how many of their intake come from northern cities, where it was seen as it was seen as natural to go to a boarding school that was nearer to the environment that it was hoped they would go back and serve. You didn't send them to Eton, you didn't send them to Harrow or Winchester or Westminster as often. And that gave it its particular flavour. Shrewsbury was sort of distinctive. There's one particular teacher there, Frank McEachran, who's known as Keck, very idiosyncratic, free market liberal thinker who was very influential on Wainwright. But it was a place of relative free thinking as a public school. Wainwright was the cox in the boating crew. Not really a natural sportsman, I don't think, but managed to find himself a place to be useful, which is one of his characteristics. It resulted in him going to Clare College in Cambridge, and there again his experience and the contacts he made there strengthened his confidence in pursuing a political career. He went on fact-finding tours around Europe in the run-up to the Second World War. He was involved in he joined the Liberal Party in 1936. Now, in 1936, the Liberal Party was smashed into at least 3 pieces, and was running at 10% or below in the polls. To join it at that point was an act of great conviction, and to continue with it required great resilience. After all, Michael Foot and Harold Wilson both joined the Liberal Party at university, but they decided not to stay with them because they would never have become leader of the opposition or prime minister had they done that. They'd worked out. So Wainwright has to be given the credit for staying with a party when large numbers of people, particularly some of their most talented and promising people, moved elsewhere. It's often thought that people who change parties are, it's a sign of greatness. Winston Churchill famously said, anyone can, he changed party twice. He said, anyone can rat, it takes real talent to re-rat. But I sometimes think actually being the person that stays, not silently, not passively in a party, critically, but stays with that party, even at its most vulnerable point, is a great credit to a person. So again, an education which was of the elite. He therefore didn't have an ordinary upbringing, but through the church, through the chapel, he did do social work with the poor of Leeds. He did, through the Lady Lane Chapel, help the unemployed. He knew about the circumstances of ordinary people during the Depression, but he did not experience them himself. There's Henry's father, Martin, and Andrew, his sons. He had 2 daughters as well, and that's Joyce, his wife. Joyce was a particularly important person in his career. She was from a prosperous family of auctioneers in Leeds, the Hollis family. And they got together quite quickly after the war, I suspect, as a lot of people did, because they've lost 6 years of potential courting. So there was a number of potential suitors were met up with Joyce through various social circles, but Richard stood out as the promising candidate, and they were married after a relatively brief engagement. The thing that was important about her was that she very much contributed to his strategy and political thinking. And in his records, there are lots of notes and comments and work that have come from her. She was a great campaigner, and she was a great liberal and was determined, like him, to stick with the Liberal Party. After their engagement, he wrote her a letter in which he looked forward to all the ways in which they might be able to change Britain and the world in the direction of liberal policy, which is perhaps not the most romantic thing you would want to receive, but it was something that was important to both of them. And he said at the end of his career, he wrote a piece for the House magazine, the House Commons in-house magazine, in which he said, when I go out campaigning, Joyce is always the one people want to see. She's the person who's made it all possible. But again, was a very determined person. When local Liberal clubs didn't admit female members, she got them to change it. She strengthened him in his convictions about the direction of the party, and also about women's role in work and politics. He acknowledged himself. So she was a very important support in a number of ways I'll come back to. During the war, as I say, he was a conscientious objector. This is his appearance at the papers of his appearance at the tribunal in Leeds, to have himself registered as a conscientious objector. He worked in the blood transfusion centre at Leeds for a time. He then travelled around different parts of the country, working in hospitals as an orderly or as an administrator. He ended up with the Friends Ambulance Unit, working its headquarters, and then going at the time of D-Day over to the continent to do ambulance work. It was not getting you out of the way of danger. He was under rocket fire in Antwerp as the Nazis retreated. He arrived at concentration camps and prison camps that were miniature versions of, or smaller versions of, Belsen and Auschwitz. He saw the most terrible outcomes of the war. What this reflected was his faith and his determination, which again he stuck to until the end of his parliamentary career, against militarism and against war. But it also meant that he had to defend that opinion in elections, and both the other main parties were happy to use it against him, and without referencing what he'd done during the war, to simply say that he was a conscientious objector and hope that that would deter some people from voting for him. He never ever downplayed it. In fact, he put it in all his election literature, anticipating, suspect that criticism would come. So when he was campaigning, there are some distinctive things about his campaigning in Pudsey, but mainly in Combe Valley, where he fought. Well, it was his sixth attempt when he got into Parliament. First two being at Pudsey, the subsequent ones being in Combe Valley. He did the usual, in those days, very closely typed, detailed, policy-heavy election addresses that candidates used to give out. But he wasn't above a bit of Ed Davey style fun and games. This is a place called Eastergate in Combe Valley, where it was alleged it was going to be filled in or blocked up because it was no good for swimming in. So he decided to be photographed by the Huddersfield Daily Examiner swimming in it. He used the press very effectively. He had a very close relationship with the Huddersfield Daily Examiner, that one of the owners of which was a leading Liberal, but also with, at the other end of his constituency, the Oldham Evening Chronicle. Sufficiently strong that the man that beat him in 1970 complained that the Oldham Evening Chronicle printed every result from the 1970 election except the Combe Valley result. They didn't want to acknowledge that Wainwright had been beaten on that occasion. And there used to be a paper called the Combe Valley Guardian. It closed in 1976. This is actually 1920s edition, but it didn't look any different in the 1970s. It was very, very detailed and we would now say somewhat ponderous style. but getting the support of those in the days when most people got most of their news from newspapers, they perhaps didn't trust them as much as they would on the television, but not so many people had a television in the 1950s and 60s. So his relationship with the press was very important. It became less important as time went on, but although he never wrote much, and he never wrote a memoir, which is partly why I was invited to examine his life, he was not confident in his own writing, interestingly, but he was very good at encouraging others to write on his behalf, writing press releases, writing election literature. And he made good use of that. He made use of his chapel presence. He preached in most chapels in the Colne Valley, and sometimes on political subjects in the era of civil rights and social reform and welfare reform. You couldn't not talk about, and the Cold War, of course, you couldn't not talk about political issues as a person of active faith, as he saw it. A couple of things that are distinctive that you wouldn't see today are his use of liberal clubs. I don't know if does anyone remember ever going in a political club? Not necessarily a liberal one, Conservative club, Trades club, Labour club. There are still a few around. This is a subject of some fascination for me, on which I've done quite a bit of subsequent work. Not just because it brings together the subjects of liberalism, the North, and licence premises, but because this is an example, but rather like the press, of one of the ways in which local opinion could actually be transmitted to politicians. Wainwright did step out slightly from Yorkshire to go to Barton-on-Humber in 1981, and he made this remark about the importance of political clubs as a way of consolidating opinion and a way of conveying or holding accountable politicians. The obvious example in Leeds, of which you must remember, was the Leeds and County Liberal Club. It's now a hotel, Quebec's, because it's on Quebec Street. Fabulous building, and many of its features do survive. Interestingly, this series of stained glass windows. It's built in 1891, representing different parts of Yorkshire. Fabulous meeting rooms, wonderful location right next to the train station. You had one of these in most big cities, the Manchester Reform Club. I'd have known that. That didn't survive beyond the 1960s, but Wainwright used to go and speak at that. The National Liberal Club in London, of course. But there are lots of small liberal clubs, many of which survive. And in Colne Valley, where Wainwright went to be a member of Parliament, there were 10 still active when and most of them still are active. These are sorry, you can't see the names there, but when you get the PowerPoint, you'll see them. Scapegoat Hill, Spring Head, Marsden, Delph. These were all places where he could hold meetings, he could have election committees. They would sometimes raise money for him. And Colne Valley had this particularly embedded community network. It was partly the press, it was partly the church, and it was partly these liberal clubs. And they would if you ever speak to people who used to go in them regularly, there would be no requirement that you answered questions on liberal policy or that you showed how you voted, but it would just be assumed that you broadly held certain views, and that would sort of be the context of conversation. And then, some of these had over 1,000 members. They were a great resource for them to use. And although Wainwright was not a particularly social animal, he was not a flamboyant person at all, quite the reverse. But he saw the value of this and used it as an opportunity to speak to lots of people. I'll say a little bit about what his character was, which I think was quite an interesting combination. He was described by one of his supporters in the Colne Valley as the man next door who could get things done. In other words, he clearly was a person of a privileged background, but he did not have airs and graces. He did not keep himself aside from his electorate, and he understood fully and was engaged with a lot of aspects of their lifestyle. Some of this set him apart from other politicians quite a lot, even other Liberal politicians who really you would expect to be more free thinking about their behaviour. He at one meeting of the then rather small Parliamentary Liberal Party, he was slightly teased by other MPs because he had a haircut. Wainwright tended to have a rather severe haircut when he built a big mop of hair up and then had a haircut. And when he was teased about this, he rather tersely said to them, "Yes, twice a year." And David Penhaligon, who was an MP for Cornwall, he said, "Yes, Richard, but why on the same day?" He invited Alan Beath, who used to be the MP for Berwick-on-Tweed, to come to a Colne Valley Liberal dinner. And Alan Beath was, "Should I wear full dinner suit?" And Wainwright said, "Of course not. Nonsense. We wouldn't do that sort of thing in Colne Valley." At which point he turned up, and of course found that only he and Wainwright were not wearing dinner suits. And he was constantly reminded by his staff of, he had to change his tie occasionally, he had to change his shoes occasionally, and presentational things. He didn't appear to mind too much about. The one thing he was obviously conscious about was accent. He was accused by his critics of becoming more of a Yorkshireman as he came up from London. He didn't like London at all. I mean, he didn't enjoy spending time in the Chamber of Parliament, where most Liberals had very little impact. Select committees he enjoyed more. And he didn't like the lifestyle of London, particularly. Refused to attend sittings after 12 midnight. And said, "I'll come in early in the morning if they're still going on, but I won't stay into the middle of the night." That kind of, I think Min Campbell said to me, "Well, he kept Methodist hours." It was very regular, very businesslike. But when he was in his constituents, he was aware of the importance of accent, and his children sort of made fun of him a bit, because he made fun of his wife because she'd been to Harrogate Ladies College, and he used to say Harrogate Ladies College, stress it hard. But then when he picked up the phone, they said he had a routine of saying Wainwright very quickly, and then he'd learn who was on the other end. And if it was someone from London, he would talk more in his Shrewsbury and Cambridge voice, and if it was the chair of the local party, we would feel free to speak Yorkshire again. And then he promoted himself in his constituency as born in Leeds of Yorkshire folk, born and bred in the West Riding. He owned his local identity, and in fact, one of his opponents, the candidate from the Labour Party who beat him in 1970, was very upset that Wainwright kept claiming that he was the local candidate, when in fact, when this Labour MP measured it, he found he lived in East Manchester, and he actually lived a couple of miles closer to Colne Valley than Wainwright did. But Wainwright never owned a house there, didn't spend a great deal of time residentially there in any way, but he was the local MP. He was the local candidate in a way other people couldn't match, because he was a Yorkshireman. And in fact, the man who took the seat from him or from the party, he retired in 1987, was a Yorkshireman, a man called Graham Riddick for the Conservatives. But again, not in terms of his culture and style and values and behaviour. And perhaps it's a shame that that sort of determination to keep your identity is not as common as it used to be. So he was very much not an informal person, but not a person of extravagance. His favourite meal was fish and chips, but he was at the same time, and he was at the same time a person of enormous consistency and integrity. And there are three issues which reflect this, really. One is the issue of law and order. He opposed the death penalty at the time when it was being abolished. And of course, his constituency included Saddleworth Moor, where the war's murderers had buried their victims. So the expectations he would support the death penalty was widespread. He was a member of Parliament during the height of the IRA bombings and refused to support the death penalty. Didn't haver about it, didn't pretend to anybody that he might do or that he would do it for certain circumstances or whatever. He was completely open about it. He was against immigration control that was being introduced in the 1960s and 70s. And when voters said to him, well, how would you like to have immigrants moving in next door to you? He invited a family of Ugandan Asians in 1972 to come and live in the Heath, Adult. And he had them stay there until they'd established a business in York. It was acknowledged in some of the Colne Valley Liberal records that this would probably cost them. His candour on these issues had probably cost them the seat in 1970. They didn't put it in the main committee minutes. They put it in the women's meeting minutes. Interestingly, I presume on the grounds they thought no one would read it, and that they thought, oh, this was a safe place to be honest with ourselves. And the third thing was, unsurprisingly, defence, where he was opposed to military escalation. And when the Liberals and Social Democrats got together, he was opposed to renewal of Britain's independent nuclear deterrent and stood out against it, as a number of other Liberals did. He also had distinctive views on, or very clear views and well-developed policy views on fiscal policy, particularly on industry and on worker ownership. And in the Lib-Lab Pact, he was able to make a little bit of progress in some nationalised industries, particularly the post office. He was able to get some worker inputs to the running of the post office. But he was Vince Cable was kind enough to write the introduction to the biography, said that Wainwright's views on tax would make the Liberal Democrats today look very pink. And he was very much a free market Liberal. He wanted to take tax down as much as possible. He wanted to limit the growing role of the state at the time in terms of control, not in terms of provision. So he was a person of strong convictions, strong honesty and hard work, but that brought him into conflict with people, of course. And here's some of the people that brought him into conflict with. This is what the Liberal Democrats looked like in the 1960s and 70s. You can see why Ed Davey is so pleased to have 72 members of Parliament, because it was effectively, this was the peak of what's been for some years. He not only lived through and benefited from the Liberal revival, he was the person who brought Jeremy Thorpe down from the leadership. In an interview he gave on BBC Leeds in 1976, after which Thorpe said, I've now got members of my own parliamentary party attacking me, I can't. And Wainwright was extraordinarily careful about how he did this. He never actually said that Thorpe had lied. He said that Thorpe's statements did not tally with the known facts. Which is what I always say to somebody now when I think they're not telling you the truth. But most other members of Parliament in the Liberal Party and a lot of other members of the Liberal Party generally were already convinced of this, but didn't have the courage or the reputation to be able to say it in public. And he faced a lot of criticism from Thorpe supporters. At one point at a Liberal assembly, even receiving a credible death threat. In this very small and sometimes, very divided group of, incredibly idiosyncratic personalities, a lot of them if you remember them, you'll know. He had to try and make his way. He made some progress in the Lib-Lab Pact. He wasn't convinced of its value, but he worked with it and stayed loyal in public as long as it was possible to do that, but was one of the first people to push for it to be brought to an end. And it was a good job from the Liberals' point of view that it was, because at the end of the Lib-Lab Pact, they were at 6 points in the opinion polls, and at the next general election, they were at 14 points. So there was a lesson there for certain other subsequent Liberal Democrat leaders who didn't get out of things earlier, that they didn't take. He was not at all sure about the Liberal Democrat, the alliance with the Social Democrats. But his statement about he was happy to work with any other party. In fact, in Colne Valley, there had been a deal with the Conservatives. In Huddersfield, there was a deal with the Conservatives in the 1950s. Asquith's daughter, Violet Bonham Carter, stood as a Liberal with the Conservative support in Colne Valley. She didn't get in, but Donald Wade, who was a friend of Wainwright's, was the MP for West Huddersfield, and the Conservatives fought the East and the Liberals fought the West. And Wainwright said, look, sometimes these things have to be done. If we're going to have any Northern Liberal MPs in the 1950s, they were that one and one in Bolton, which ran on the same basis, were the only ones. He said, we have to do that. There is Violet Bonham Carter being depicted being tempted into the Tory tiger. I didn't know why. I'm sorry. I did think of sending that to the Liberal Democrats leader in a frame in 2010, but yeah, he probably had other things on his mind. There was the possibility of a deal with Labour in the 60s, Joe Griffin with Wilson. There was the Lib-Lab Pact. There was even the possibility of going into government with Edward Heath in 1974. It didn't come off, and Wainwright didn't want it to. But again, was very judicious in how he advanced his opinion. Never dishonest, but used the right timing. Here's a classic example, actually. Bill Rogers, former Labour minister, who formed the SDP, when I contacted him about Wainwright, said, you can tell Wainwright liked the idea of an alliance, because there he is, smiling, talking to me and David Steele. That just demonstrates how Wainwright rationed the expression of his opinions. They were always honest, but they were never extravagant. And he wasn't at all certain about the SDP Liberal Alliance, but he was happy to work with it as long as it lasted. Well, there's Joe Griffin in the back reading the guideline. He later became an official of he became president of the Yorkshire Liberal Democrats, but only after great uncertainty. Last thing I'd ask is, what would he have thought? Well, we know he said to Paddy Ashdown, you can work with another party, but you always have to retain your independence. It has to be a relationship of tension. You have to be prepared to say no when you really mean no. So who you work with isn't the question. How you work is the question. And I suspect when it comes to the next election, that might be important, not only as it was important for these two gentlemen and for these two, where I suspect Wainwright. Simon Hughes said, he was asked at the launch of the book, actually in 2011, whether Wainwright would have supported the introduction of student tuition fees. And Hughes said, actually, he talked about having student tuition fees. He thought there could be a case for it, but he wouldn't have done it because we'd promised not to do it. So the important thing would have been staying true, not doing what was necessary to keep you in office, or even doing what you particularly wanted to do at that particular moment. Loyalty to leaders that he'd not agreed with is something he, whilst he tried to move things on, was a great characteristic. Well, I hope I've given the lessons for Liberal Democrats are the people you've never heard of are sometimes very important people. And that's a lesson for all political parties, actually, because particularly small parties often rely on rather loud, rather visible leaders. And they often don't last because of it. And as soon as the leader goes wrong, the party goes wrong. For a party to succeed, it needs to have a body of people, a kind of middle rank of people who will always be there, will always be loyal, and who will always be willing to raise problems when there are problems. And I think there is a lesson here about staying loyal to your origins. And although he never represented Leeds, he was a very proud Yorkshireman. He was proud to come from Leeds. And this is part of what made him work in the county. He was once asked by a colleague, Richard, you never give up. Why do you go out to some scout hut in Goole and speak to 3 people? And he says, well, there might only be 3 people. But he says, the fact is, one of them might be mad, one of them might be bored, but one of them might be a future Liberal Democrat present MP. And that's what I've got to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that really interesting and engaging talk and for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. I think you've painted a picture of someone who we can say sounds like a really nice guy, and putting it in a down to earth way. Do people have observations, questions that they'd like to put to Matt? Is there anything on the comments on the Zoom, Alan? Did I see one comment? I don't know. No, you've silenced us all.
Can I ask, at his funeral, what sort of somebody would have written a tribute, like led the tribute?
Yeah,
who would that be?
Caught me out. There was a use, in fact, a number of tributes, and it was very well attended service. But I will clarify that way.
I'm just interested in what reaction.
What Matt leading will get back in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes, I was asked about who gave the tribute at Wainwright's funeral, and it was a leading Liberal politician, although there were a number of tributes, and it was very, very well attended service. He'd still been involved in politics, as I say, being eventually drawn into the merged Liberal Democrats, but his experience showed how that there was a lot of focus on Dr. David Owen, who on the other side of the alliance walked away. There were a lot of Liberals who were very uneasy about it, but in the end, to give the example of Michael Meadowcroft, they decided that the best vehicle for liberalism was Liberal Democrats. But needed a lot of persuading, and he'd been involved in that. He'd been involved in the local party. He'd been involved in the wider share ownership council and the campaign for proportional representation, all of those things during his retirement as well. So he maintained contact and kept advising leaders as well. All the leaders up until Paddy Ashdown and Charles Kennedy he had contact with. And Paddy Ashdown said, look, if something was all right with Richard, it was all right with me. That he was the voice of experience back then, of course.
Yeah. And presumably he favoured proportional representation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was part of the logic, I think, of saying that it was all right to work with other parties as long as it was done in the right way. That's always a difficult thing for Liberal politicians, because if they do engage in arrangements with other parties, they almost inevitably do it from a weaker position, makes them more vulnerable. On the other hand, they're the people that argue that's what parties should do. It's just we're not in the circumstances where they would want to do it, which is through the PR.
Yeah.
So yes, out of necessity, he would work with other parties, and also, I mean, MPs from other parties. He worked with Bear Grylls, his dad, Michael Grylls, on small businesses. He helped Frank Field get into Parliament by getting support for him from the Joseph Rowntree Trust. So individual MPs and other parties he could form a working relationship with. But yes, he always wanted PR. But we have to bear in mind that was so much of it sounds unkind to say, a bit of a pipe dream in the 1960s and 70s. We now have elections by various forms of proportional representation in Scotland and Wales. We did have them in Europe. We have them in Northern Ireland. We've had different electoral systems from first past the post for electing mayors. We're quite used to experimenting with the electoral system. At the time Wainwright was campaigning, it was seen as a distant objective, and almost academic obsession. But he believed in it, yes, no doubt.
Yeah.
Did he have a view on the House of Lords?
Yes, very, very strong one. He was offered a place in the House of Lords and refused it. His view on the House of Lords was you go to Visitor Cemetery, you don't work in it. That was one of the less blunt. It was in a way it was a reflection of the sort of old liberalism that he represented, the liberalism of 19th and early 20th century Leeds, of the House of Lords, end it or mend it, sort of Gladstonian and Lloyd George opposition to the House of Lords. But it was also it foresaw what was going to happen to the House of Lords, which was most of the hereditary peers would go. What he would have thought of a mainly overwhelmingly appointed House of Lords, I'm not sure. But he saw it as a hereditary house. Again, bear in mind it was. He wouldn't join it. And Liberal peerages were very, very thin on the ground in those days, and they were rarely given. And there's no documentary record of it, but David Steele says, yes, I was certainly offered a peerage, and a number of other people have said it as well. And yes, to get another example of, there are a lot of people who are critical of the House of Lords suddenly, see its value when they're offered a place in it. And he wasn't one of those.
You said he was quite a free marketeer, in favour of small government, and you had a picture of Keith Joseph. So did he not get on with the new principles of Keith Joseph and the beginning of Thatcherism?
What he wanted in terms of economic and industrial policy, well, he wanted more worker-owned cooperatives. Again, that was something that the Liberals were not in a position to bring about because they didn't control national policy. But it was one of his greatest enthusiasms. He wanted the tax rate kept low. But I think when we think about tax being cut, we too often think about Margaret Thatcher and the reduction of the top rate of income tax from, what was it, 83 pence in the pound for earned income, 98 for unearned income, down to 40 pence in the pound as it is now. But remember that it was a Liberal Democrat policy and was one of their few achievements in the coalition government, that they raised the income tax threshold. That's a way of reducing the tax burden. And of course, the other parties, having realised this was a popular policy, then adopted it. But so there's a number of ways of reducing the tax burden. So you wouldn't necessarily associate it with Thatcherism. And one of the things that David Alton said, because David Alton, MP for Liverpool Edge Hill, was in Parliament in the 1980s with Wainwright up until 1987. And I said, well, you know, what was the difference between, what would he have thought about Margaret Thatcher? He didn't, you know, he didn't make individual or personal attacks on people. And Alton said probably his first words would have been mean-spirited. It would have been, we're going to cut taxes, but we're not going to, we'll do that simply by removing services. Now, if you cut taxes to create growth and it works, and you cut them for the people who need it most first, and that's what the tax threshold policy was intended to do, then he would have been happy with that. He didn't think that the public should be told what to do by the government any more than is absolutely necessary. It goes all the way back to John Stuart Mill. And in economic policy, he would have been keen on trying to reduce the tax burden in the right ways with the right context.
You didn't have a view about monetarism, for example.
I think he thought it was a kind of I mean, monetarism, because, you know, came from largely from the Chicago School in America, and also from you know, from Hayek in terms of, you know, Austrian post-war liberalism. And I think the context is completely different. He'd have said, look, monetarism is doing the economics without the social policy. It's, you know, some of its individual objectives might be useful, but you know, on the question of the money supply and inflation, for example, again, one of the things Alton said, you know, he's fond of saying, look, there's no inflation in the graveyard. A bit of inflation isn't necessarily a problem. It's not being able to handle. That's the problem. So the obsession with the money supply, I don't think he would have seen as the kind of silver bullet to solve economic problems.
Yeah.
And the failure to deal with the consequences of pursuing that policy. You know, I mean, he was in favour of minimum wage. So he's in favour of some regulation of the market, but drawing money away from people's incomes relentlessly in order to supply services that about which they had no choice was something he would have been more uneasy about.
Okay, we've got two more questions in the row. I think Alan's got.
It's a question on Zoom, Alan Mann, who asked, did he ever write about his wartime experiences, and in particular his experience in liberating German camps?
Oh, well, to say a little bit more about that, yes, I mean, Wainwright moved after D-Day, moved across Europe from west to east, and there are two aspects to what he saw of camps. There were camps of displaced persons that he saw, which had terrible conditions in them. And as I say, he saw victims of starvation, persecution. But he also heard from firsthand from people who'd been to Auschwitz and Belsen, and understood what had happened there, perhaps earlier than other people would have done. So yes, he saw examples of the victims of the Holocaust and the circumstances of it, and he heard about the worst examples. He also noted what had happened to particularly German civilians at the hands of some Allied troops. And he said, well, let's not forget that he was once asked to give you know, after the war, one of the things that chapels did was to invite people to give their experiences of war and say, look, was it worth it? I suppose would be the theme of it. And he, like a lot of people, declined to do it, wouldn't talk about the war. And he did tell his family a couple of stories about seeing people, herded into buildings that were then burned down by Allied supporters, not by Allied troops, but by the liberated French or Dutch or other nationalities. And it was that tendency of war to produce the worst in people and to reveal the worst in people that I think he took away from it. Obviously, his obligation to try to mitigate that as far as possible, but that war does not produce something better, was always his view. Now, that was a distinctive view to, you think about the post-war political world. People like Dennis Healey presented themselves to the electorate as Sergeant Healey. People were known by their military rank. And if you didn't name your military rank, people said, why? And so for him to say, no military rank, and moreover, I didn't fight in the war. And then for his opponents, obviously not to want to listen to anything that he did do, was a brave thing to do.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've got another question at the back.
You alluded to his role in relation to Jeremy Thorpe's disposal. He served under or alongside a number of Liberal leaders, obviously. What did they think of him? How did that translate into his position in terms of, I suppose, the Liberal Party nationally and its leadership and its policy positions? Did they ever give him any significant national or policy roles?
Yeah, well, you had to have a national policy role in the Liberal Party because there was only 13 of them.
Yeah.
If you're going to cover 20 departments, you do them out. But he stuck to economic portfolios. He could perfectly well have done foreign policy ones. For example, with the Joseph Rowntree Trust, he'd travel to Guinea-Bissau to look at, post-colonial government or liberation movements. He had a great interest in defence, but he knew that it would be a potential weakness for his party, and I expect his leaders knew it would be a potential weakness for them to be seen to be represented by somebody who wouldn't use arms in any circumstance. So he steered away from that. He stuck to economic things where he was very good. He was a member of in the days when the Liberals were lucky to get one seat on a select committee, he was the one on the Treasury Committee. Was very, very Peter Hennessy, Lord Hennessy, once said to me he was one of the most effective members of a select committee. His command of detail and his ability to focus the right question, and sometimes just ask the question, why, or what does that mean? And put somebody on the spot was very, very good in the economic field. What leaders thought of him was, he was in the Liberals and the Liberal Democrats for 4 elections. They didn't used to elect the leader. They used to just sort of see who was left. And I think, Clement Davis was elected because nobody else wanted the job. But he was involved in 4 elections for Liberal and Liberal Democrat leaders, and he backed one of the losers every time. So his leaders wouldn't necessarily be well disposed of him. He was known to be a very self-confident, very resilient, but also very expert person. And as time went on, I suspect more and more, those leaders up to and including Paddy Ashdown, who's the last one to deal with him in any detail, saw him as a person you might not agree with, but they were worth listening to. Of course, by then he was no longer in Parliament, so Ashdown might have felt a little less uneasy about taking his advice. David Steele he had a very difficult relationship with, because at the time of the alliance and of Lib-Lab Pact, Wainwright thought he was selling the party too cheaply, to put it simply. Steele ended up writing to Wainwright saying, your letters are beginning to take the form of those copied to the Queen and written in green ink. Now, to be fair, Steele attended the launch of the book and had nice things to say about him, but they'd obviously had a difficult relationship. Here's one of the other things that came out in the course of this, and asked how to describe Wainwright. His son Martin, great follower and admirer of his, of course, said he reminded him of a man called Hiram York in Shirley by one of the Bronte sisters. I've forgotten which one. And Hiram York is a Yorkshire entrepreneur who sticks to his opinion and who is rebellious. Rebellion was in his blood, is the phrase that's used of him. And Martin copied that phrase, said, and I think about my father when I think of that. And he said, priests, dynasties, kings, all their titles, all their claims meant nothing to him. They were rubbish. That's what Bronte says of this character. And I think that's how leaders would have seen Wainwright. They would have said, okay, we're not going to get anything for free here. We're going to have to justify ourselves. And some of them, therefore, would have been a bit reluctant to hear the message.
Okay, thank you. Great.